This video is designed to introduce the idea of photosynthesis as a process. And as we work our way through this chapter, it's going to be very easy to get caught up in the small details of this process. What I'm hoping you'll do is periodically just come back to this video to make sure you get a big picture perspective on what's going on. One of the most important things you can do is just maintain that concept for what's happening in the larger sense. So this is just going to be like sort of an overview of the entire process. We'll get into the little parts of like how each particular step works in detail as we work our way through the chapter. But the first thing that we have to talk about is where this is even happening. If you remember from our chapter on cells, the organelle called the chloroplast is where the process of photosynthesis is taking place. There are two parts to the chloroplast, and this chapter we're going to be calling back on a lot of the information from cells. But one of the main things that you should remember about the chloroplast is that it has two membranes, just like the mitochondria did. It has a membrane around the outside, and then it has membranes on the inside. Now these things on the inside that make up the membranes, I always think they look like green Nilla wafers almost. Those are called the thylakoids. So we'll write that one in over here. Thylakoid, thylakoid. This is where part of the process of photosynthesis is taking place. The other part, and this line maybe isn't super clear, but it's pointing to the space around the thylakoid. There's fluid on the inside of the chloroplast, and that space is referred to as the stroma. S-T-R-O-M-A. Stroma. So these are the two main parts of the chloroplast. There's going to be a different portion of the process of photosynthesis happening in each of these two parts, because it is a two-part process. So we'll actually start with the thylakoid, and then we move on to the process that's going on in the stroma. So we'll take a second and look at some other diagrams to kind of give you an idea of what's going on during these processes. Both of these diagrams, this one here that I just blew up and the one in the corner that we'll deal with in a second, they both represent the same thing. It's just two slightly different ways of looking at it. I use this diagram because it's the one in the book. The other one maybe makes things a little bit more clear, so after we're done talking about this first one, if you're still a little unsure of what I'm talking about, then the second one may help a little bit. But to start off, this process is a cycle. So like all cycles, it's going to move in a circle, and it's kind of hard to figure out, well, where does it start and where does it stop? I think to make things easiest is to think about it starting with the process that's going on in the thylakoid. So those were those green stacks that look like little green coins, or like I said, those green Nilla wafers, like the little cookies. That's where we'll begin. And in order to understand this process, like I talked about in class, you have to understand the formula for photosynthesis. The earlier you memorize that in the chapter, the easier it's going to make things for you. But the first part of the process is called the light-dependent reactions. As the name implies, this requires light. So whether it's sunlight or if you've got a plant inside and it's absorbing, artificial light from, lights you have in your house, it doesn't matter as long as light is present. So what light's going to be used to do is actually split up water molecules. The product that's made here is actually a waste product. It shows O2, oxygen leaving. If you remember our formula again, that was one of the things on the right-hand side. So that's a product that's leaving this process. But the main thing that's made during the light-dependent reactions, right down here, there's ATP and NADPH. These things are both technically like the same general family of molecules. We're going to call these guys energy carriers. Now ATP and NADPH are a little bit different, but they both carry energy that can be used in different places in the cell. So basically the energy that's made during the light-dependent reactions goes on to the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is the part that's happening in the stroma. Remember from the picture before, the stroma is like the fluid that surrounds the thylakoid inside of the chloroplast. So here we've got the energy carriers that left the light-dependent reactions. They react with carbon dioxide and more water in order to produce sugars. Remember, sugars or glucose, those are the main products that are being made at the end of this process. That's the main purpose of doing this for plants. Now, it may seem like that's the end, but keep in mind this is a cycle. So things have to go back up to where we started in the beginning. We started with the light-dependent reactions, so we're headed back there. The thing that goes back to the light-dependent reactions is ADP and NADP+. So just like we talked about in class how ATP is like a full battery and ADP is an uncharged battery, it's the same kind of idea with NADP+. This is just like the uncharged version of those energy carriers. So we'll just call these guys uncharged. So the whole purpose of going back up here is for them to get charged again so they can be used the second time through this process. Keep in mind, this is just a very general overview. We're going to spend a lot of time in class talking about what the heck actually happens during the light-dependent reactions in order to produce oxygen and ATP and NADPH, and then how exactly the Calvin cycle works in the stroma to take the carbon dioxide and water and produce sugar, leaving us with these uncharged molecules that end up going back to the light-dependent reactions to be charged again. Another way of looking at this is represented in the second diagram. We'll go through this one a little bit quicker because it's really all the same stuff we just talked about before. It's just a different way of showing it. Again, that first one's in your book. This is one that I kind of stole from online. This shows you the chloroplast here, and again it represents the thylakoids, those little stacks of coins, and the stroma is the area around it. It breaks it down into two different steps, just like the representation has in your textbook. We got the light-dependent reactions, which are taking in water, just like the other diagram showed, giving off oxygen as a waste product, and producing high-energy molecules. These high-energy molecules are our ATP and our NADPH. Those high-energy molecules then go down to the light-dependent reactions, where they're used to make sugar using carbon dioxide, and technically there's water involved in this one as well. The reason I don't like this diagram quite as much is it doesn't give you the idea of this being a cycle. It's having the products from here going back up to the top and starting over again. So it's a different way of representing things. It's a little bit simpler, but I don't think it does quite as good of a job in capturing the entire picture. This is starting to get a little bit longer than I wanted, so we'll sort of stop with that one there. The most important thing to take away from this is just where things are happening. So you should know the difference between the stroma and the thylakoid inside of the cell, and then also the idea that this entire process is a cycle. It's very, very good to know what's produced where and where it's moving to. Keep in mind, we're going to be referring back to this one many times because this acts as a great little overview of this entire process. I mean, there's a lot going on here. We'll talk about many of the details about what is exactly happening during the light-dependent reactions and what's happening during the Calvin cycle. But you have to maintain this big picture idea in order to truly grasp this chapter. So as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you in class.